name's Daniel, and I never thought I'd be the type to share a story like this. My family's had land in northern Georgia for 3 generations, and I grew up on that farm. It was supposed to be quiet, honest living, mornings filled with the sound of chickens, evenings with cicadas humming in the trees, and nights so dark you could see every star in the sky. But that peace, it didn't last. It started small, the kind of thing you wouldn't think twice about. A few chickens went missing from the coop. It happens. Foxes, raccoons. Nature has a way of thinning your flock no matter how tight you build the pen. Dad just shrugged, muttering, "Damn critters," and went about his day. The next night, though, the noise woke us. Not the usual clucks or squawks. These were screams. If you've never heard a chicken scream, it'll crawl right down your spine. By the time we got to the coop, it was over. The door was hanging half open, and feathers littered the dirt like snow. We found them in the morning, the bodies. They weren't eaten the way a coyote would. They weren't carried off like a fox might. No. Their torsos were ripped open, and pieces were missing, chunks bitten out like someone had taken a plate to dinner and left the rest behind. Dad stood over them with his jaw clenched. "That's no dog, that's no fox," he said. But what else could it be? The next night, we locked the coop tighter, double-checked every latch, sat on the porch with rifles across our knees, waiting for something to move in the tree line. But nothing came. Hours passed. We gave up, went to bed, and tried to tell ourselves it was over. That was the night my brother saw it. He was 13, barely old enough to hold his nerves together, but he swore he wasn't dreaming. He woke up to a sound at his window, a soft tap, tap, tap. And when he pulled back the curtain, it was there, a face. Not human, not animal, something in between. Too pale, too stretched. Its mouth hung slightly open, and when it smiled, if you could call that jagged twist of its lips a smile, its teeth glinted in the moonlight. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at him through the glass. He screamed loud enough to wake the whole house. Dad stormed down the hall with his shotgun, but by the time he threw the window open, there was nothing there. Just the wind in the pines. We tried to tell my brother it was a nightmare, a trick of the dark, but his hands shook for hours and his face stayed pale all through breakfast. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was the first real sign that something had found us, and it wasn't done. The morning after my brother swore he'd seen that face, Dad and I went out to check the property. We expected nothing, maybe just to reassure him it was all in his head. But when we got near the barn, we froze. There, in the mud, were footprints. Huge ones. At first glance, they looked human, but the scale was all wrong. Dad slipped his boot into one print for size, and it barely filled 2/3 of the space, and there were too many toes, long, splayed, and ending in points that dug deep into the earth. I'll never forget the way Dad just stared at them. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but that silence told me everything. He finally muttered, "Ain't no animal I've ever seen." That night, the animals knew before we did. The horses stomped and snorted in their stalls, eyes rolling white. The pigs wouldn't stop squealing, smashing against their pen like they were desperate to escape. Even the dogs, usually fearless, whimpered and hid beneath the porch, tails tucked. We sat out on the porch again, shotguns across our laps, waiting. The woods felt alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. And then, eyes. 2, glowing a dull yellow just beyond the tree line. low at first, then rising higher, standing upright. Dad hissed, "You see that?" I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He raised his rifle and the crack split the night. The figure vanished into the brush. Then came the sound. Not a coyote yelp, not a dog's cry. This was a wail, long and piercing like metal screaming against stone. It echoed through the trees and into our bones, so alien it made my stomach turn. But when we searched the next morning, nothing. No blood, no body. Just churned dirt and broken branches where something huge had moved through. We weren't imagining it. A few nights later, Dad finally gave in and called the sheriff. Sheriff Barnes was an old-timer, the kind who'd seen every kind of trouble in the county. He came out in his cruiser, lights flashing, shaking his head at our story. "You're spooked over coyotes," he said, leaning on his car. "Panthers, maybe, though I doubt it. You folks need sleep more than you need me." But he stayed, maybe out of pity, maybe because he didn't want word getting out that he ignored a family in need. That night, we all waited together. Hours ticked by. The woods were too quiet, the way they get before a storm. Then, movement. Figures. More than one, slipping between the trees. Too tall, too thin, shoulders hunched. Their eyes glowed like coals weaving between the pines. Barnes straightened, his hand falling to the revolver on his hip. "What in God's name?" he whispered. The moment he saw those eyes, all the doubt drained from his face. When one of the shapes stepped closer, he panicked and fired. The blast roared, and again, that scream. But just like before, nothing fell. Nothing stayed behind. The sheriff's hands shook as he reloaded, his voice low. "I don't know what the hell that was, but it ain't anything I've seen before." For the first time, it wasn't just us anymore. Someone else had seen them. Someone who wasn't supposed to believe. And that made it all the worse. Because if the law couldn't stop them, what chance did we have? The nights dragged on, each one heavier than the last. None of us slept anymore. We'd sit in the living room with the lamps dimmed, rifles within arm's reach, listening to the wind press against the old house, and waiting for the sound we all dreaded, that scream from the tree line. But sometimes silence was worse. It was near midnight when my brother pointed out the window and said, "Daddy, the horse." We all turned. There, just at the edge of the field where the grass grows high and sways in the breeze, stood our mare, Daisy. She was pacing nervously near the tree line, her mane tossing in the moonlight. But Daisy wasn't supposed to be there. Dad had locked her stall himself, bolted the barn door. We'd checked twice. My stomach sank. Something about the way she moved was off. Her legs bent too stiffly, her head turned in a way horses shouldn't, jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by the wrong strings. "Don't you open that door," Dad growled, though no one had moved. "That ain't our horse." Still, the sight clawed at us. Daisy was ours, our best animal. To see her standing there, waiting, felt like bait dangling on a hook. The horse raised her head, staring toward the house. Then she let out a whinny so sharp and broken it sounded like metal scraping against bone. My brother covered his ears and whimpered. Dad shouldered his rifle. His hands didn't tremble, but his jaw was tight as stone. Through the window, we watched as he lined up the shot, muttering under his breath, almost like a prayer. Then, crack. The horse shattered into nothing. Not blood, Not bone, just gone, as though it had never been there at all. Silence followed, deep and smothering. And in that silence from the barn came the sound of cattle panicking, hooves slamming, low, terrified moos. We bolted out the back door, guns raised, lanterns swinging. By the time we got there, 2 of the cows were gone. The stall was smashed open, splinters of wood littering the dirt floor. No blood, no trail, just emptiness. We searched until dawn, combing the pastures and edges of the forest. And when the sun finally broke, we found what was left. One of the cows lay crumpled near the creek bed, body mangled, ribs cracked open. Its eyes were wide, tongue swollen, as if whatever had killed it wanted to terrify as much as feed. The second was never found. Dad stood over the body, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. He whispered, "They're playing with us." That night we set bonfires around the property. The flames licked the dark, casting long, flickering shadows across the fields. For a while it seemed to hold the creatures back. We could see them there, shapes just beyond the firelight, pacing, circling, watching. But the longer we stared, the more we realized something. They weren't afraid of the fire. They were waiting. The siege had only just begun. By the 4th week, our farm didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a trap we'd been foolish enough to build for ourselves. Every shadow seemed too deep. Every gust of wind carried whispers that weren't there. Even in daylight, the fields seemed wrong. The grass lay flat in strange patterns. The barn door never stayed latched, and the woods never stopped watching. That night, the air itself was heavy, as if holding its breath. We gathered in the living room with our rifles, lamps burning low, the smell of kerosene thick in our lungs. My brother sat curled in a blanket, muttering prayers he hadn't said since he was little. Mom clutched her Bible in one hand, a revolver in the other. Dad sat by the window, staring out at the bonfires we'd built around the house. Their glow was weak, paling against the black beyond. "They're waiting," he whispered, more to himself than us. "They're just waiting." The waiting ended sooner than any of us wanted. It started with the dogs. They'd been hiding under the porch for days, too scared to bark at shadows. But suddenly they bolted, snarling, charging out into the yard like they'd seen the devil himself. Their barks split the night, fierce and furious, until they cut off all at once. A yelp, a strangled cry, then silence. We rushed to the porch in time to hear a low whimper. Dad swung his lantern out and the flame caught just enough to show us a single collar lying in the dirt, twisted and torn. The dogs were gone. Before we could react, the first thud hit the wall. It was like a log thrown against the siding, rattling the windows. Then another, and another. Claws scraped against the glass, long and deliberate. Nails squealing as they dragged down the panes. "Inside!" Dad barked, shoving us back toward the center of the house. We slammed shutters, locked every door, but it didn't matter. The walls themselves shuddered with every blow, as if the house wasn't being attacked, it was being tested. The roof groaned overhead. Something heavy moved across it, slow and purposeful. Dust sifted down from the rafters. I remember Mom whispering, "Lord, please," over and over. Dad and I threw open a window and fired into the dark. The gunfire ripped through the night, echoing back at us. For a heartbeat, the flames outside revealed them. Shapes, wrong, too tall, too thin, with arms that dragged too long at their sides. Their faces flashed pale and angular, mouths split wide in gaping snarls. Their eyes glowed, catching the firelight in colors no living things should. We hit one. I swear we did. It staggered, shrieked, clutching at its shoulder. But when another pulled it back into the tree line, there was no blood. Nothing but silence. The silence didn't last. Windows rattled again, claws scraping as if dozens of hands pressed against the glass. The walls shook under pounding blows. Something slammed into the back door so hard the hinges screamed. "They're trying to get in!" my brother cried, his voice breaking. "They won't," Dad said, though his voice didn't carry any of the certainty it used to. Then the yard went still. Too still. That's when we saw it. One of our last cows was shoved into the open, stumbling out from behind the barn. It staggered across the yard, eyes rolling, froth at its mouth. Something had driven it into the firelight, straight toward us. Behind it, the tree line rippled. We couldn't see the creatures directly, but we knew they were there, herding it like wolves. Dad cursed under his breath, raised his rifle and fired. But before the shot landed, the cow collapsed. Its throat was torn wide open as if invisible hands had struck it down. My brother screamed, and Mom dragged him back, clutching his face against her chest. Dad lowered his gun, his jaw tight, muttering, "They're playing with us." And then the games began. They circled the house all night. One moment, claws raked across the siding, shaking the walls. The next, windows shuddered as faces pressed against the glass, faces pale and grinning, eyes burning with cruel light. We fired again and again, but it made no difference. Every shot ended in a wail, but nothing ever fell. At one point, the front door handle rattled violently, jerking as though something were trying to twist it open from the outside. We shoved a dresser against it, hearts pounding. Minutes later, a soft tapping came at the kitchen window. Tap, tap, tap. When I forced myself to look, I wished I hadn't. A hand was pressed against the glass. Too long, too many fingers, each ending in pointed tips. Slowly, deliberately, it dragged down the pane, leaving a screech like metal on stone. We sat in the center of the house, lamps dimmed, hearts thundering. The walls shuddered under blows. The roof groaned as footsteps prowled across it. The air filled with guttural wails, shrieks that rattled our bones. And then it would stop. Silence. 5 minutes. 10. Just long enough for us to think maybe they were done. Then a slam shook the wall so hard the dishes tumbled from the cupboard, shattering across the floor. My brother sobbed. Mom prayed louder. We were being broken down, piece by piece. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't have to be. By the time the lamps sputtered and the fires outside burned low, we were slumped against the walls, rifles clutched tight, too exhausted to move, too terrified to close our eyes. And in that moment, I realized something that froze my blood more than the screams. They weren't trying to get in. They were trying to keep us in. By the end of that week, we were shadows of ourselves. None of us slept. Our eyes were bloodshot, nerves fried. Every creak of the house made us jump. Every gust of wind through the grass felt like claws raking against the walls. We fired through the glass, desperate. My ears rang with the thunder of shotguns, the acrid sting of gunpowder filling the room. Shapes moved outside the flickering firelight, long limbs twisting, mouths opening in soundless grins before shrieking into the night. We stopped pretending this was about predators. These things weren't after food. They were after us. The fifth night came heavy and hot, the kind of Georgia summer night that clings to your skin. The bonfires sputtered low. We hadn't the strength to keep them stoked anymore. We huddled in the living room, all of us armed, waiting. Waiting had become its own torture, and then the waiting ended. The first blow on the siding nearly knocked the pictures from the walls. Another slammed against the back door, bending the wood. Windows rattled as claws scraped again and again, deliberate, like fingernails on a coffin lid. "They're worse tonight," Mom whispered, her voice barely a thread. "They're close to done playing," Dad said, though his hands trembled as he loaded shells into the shotgun. The roof groaned, sagged, dust falling from the rafters. Something enormous crawled across it, claws clicking against shingles. Then came the sound of breathing, long, slow, drawn out, pressing against every window at once. We hit them. Again and again, I know we did. Each time a scream followed, bone deep and alien, and each time the darkness swallowed them whole, leaving nothing. The house shook under the assault. Dishes fell, walls groaned, nails squealed as boards strained. My brother sobbed openly, clutching his rifle like a toy. Then came the laughter. Not human, not right. A chorus of low, guttural chuckles surrounding the house, echoing from the tree line. The sound scraped at the back of my skull until I thought I'd go mad. "Stay inside," Dad barked, though his eyes darted toward the door. Then we heard it. A voice, clear as day from just beyond the porch. "Daniel." My name, drawn out, broken, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine, wasn't anyone's. Then it spoke my brother's name. Then Mom's. Each one whispered like a lure, coaxing us toward the door. My brother nearly bolted. Mom had to grab him, drag him back by his arm, whispering, "Don't listen, baby. Don't listen." The voices grew louder, layered, overlapping, mocking us with our own names, our own words. I heard myself yelling from the yard, though my mouth hadn't moved. And then silence. That was worse than the noise. Dad stood at the window, scanning the yard, breath heavy. "They're trying to draw us out," he muttered. "Don't fall for it." But something moved in the field, just beyond the dying firelight. Our cows, the last of them, stumbling, driven into the open. They bellowed, terrified, their hooves pounding as they ran back and forth. Something unseen was hurting them, pushing them closer to the house. One by one, they vanished, yanked into the grass, pulled into the shadows. Their cries cut off mid-scream. By morning, there'd be nothing left. Mom started crying then, quiet at first, then racking sobs. "We can't stay, David. We can't keep doing this." Dad didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the tree line, his finger tight on the trigger. The hours stretched on. We sat in silence, waiting for the next blow, the next scream. But it never came. Sometime near dawn, the air shifted. The house grew still. The pressure that had weighed on us for weeks lifted just a little. The woods fell quiet. We didn't trust it. None of us moved until sunlight broke across the horizon. Only then did Dad ease open the door. The yard was torn to hell, fences splintered, barn doors ripped off their hinges, the earth stamped with dozens, no, hundreds of footprints. The cattle were gone, the dogs gone, Chickens, pigs, everything we had raised, everything we'd built this farm on, gone. Only the house remained, and us, trapped inside. The sheriff never came back. We never called him again. By the end of that week, we packed what little we could and left. We never looked back at that house, never stepped foot on that land again. And sometimes, when the night's too quiet, I swear I can hear it again. The scraping claws on the glass, the laughter in the trees, and my own name whispered from the dark. Because I know it wasn't about the animals. It was about us. And they're still out there, waiting. And that's where the story of the Georgia farm ends, or at least where the family's account does. They abandoned their land, their animals, and the house that had sheltered 3 generations. They never went back. But the story didn't stay contained. A neighbor, living a few miles down the road, heard the rumors. He thought it was all just nerves and superstition, farm folk scaring themselves with shadows in the trees. He laughed it off. Until one morning he woke to find his chicken coop door hanging wide open. Feathers scattered across the dirt, and bodies with pieces missing. No predators left tracks, no blood trailed away. Just emptiness where life had been. Maybe the creatures weren't bound to that farm. Maybe they were never after the livestock at all. Maybe they were just moving. So if you find yourself out in the country late at night, with only the trees and the fields to keep you company, make sure the windows are locked. And if you hear your name whispered from the dark, don't answer. This has been another tale from Campfire Horror Stories. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It means the world to a new channel and helps us bring more of these horrors to light. And remember, the darkness is patient, and it's always listening.